So over to you and your brilliant dad jokes. Have fun.
All right, cool. Yep, so thanks everybody for coming. Just to let you know, this talk's about 30 minutes, so we'll have 15 minutes of fun talky time afterwards. But, and also I've been tweeting dad jokes all day with the hashtag B-sides in case anybody wants some of my other ones out there. So, yeah, today we're going to talk about a piece of malware that was called Dad Joke. It's actually used by the actor Leviathan, or some people refer to as APT40. So before we get into it, I just want to say a few things. First off, credit where credit's due. Thanks to FireEye, we have names like Dad Bod and Dad Joke and Dad Shorts. This is fun. But special credit to Nick Carr and Rick Cole. Without their tweets that I'll show you later on, I basically wouldn't have been able to find any of this stuff in the first place. So kudos to them. Just want to make sure I say that first. Hopefully we'll be releasing a blog shortly. It's already written. We're just going through to make sure we don't say anything we shouldn't say in there. And I'd like to try to coordinate that with FireEye. So we'll see if that actually happens, but hopefully in the next couple weeks. Obviously, there's dad jokes contained herein, so please feel free to laugh or boo, but please don't throw any tomatoes at me. They are dad jokes. So, the first one. This is good. I'll give you a second to read it. I kind of like that one. He was on duty. So we'll get into the initial discovery of the malware. Obviously, most of the stuff that we talk about nowadays, it usually starts with a fish. So back in August of this past year, we saw a wave of attacks that was targeting a specific ministry in Southeast Asia in particular, Ministry of Defense. And while it was a wave of spearfishes, it really wasn't super widespread. We actually only found about 3 documents that targeted a couple different users. 2 of the users were actually overseas, not in Southeast Asia. 1 was actually in Southeast Asia, but they all worked for the ministry. So it wasn't really widespread. It was an interesting phishing campaign. Usually you'll see them blast an entire agency with hundreds of emails, but in this case, this kind of piqued my interest. So when I started looking at it, the delivery method itself was actually kind of unique too, and it had an interesting, very intricate, ornate delivery chain that we'll talk about. But basically, it was a Word document that got sent to the users. It had a couple embedded executables, specifically an EXE and a DLL inside of it. It contained, or actually reached out and grabbed a remote template, pulled down a macro inside of the template, executed it, and did load order hijacking, or what some folks call sideloading. So I said, okay, this is interesting. I'll go try to find some more. So I looked at the location of where the remote template was, and I quickly discovered that I wasn't really going to go anywhere with this one because the actor used a short-lived campaign. So this was pretty interesting and unique to me as well, the fact that the actor flipped the switch. This is based on our passive DNS system, but you can see they started the campaign on August 29th. They turned it off on the 12th. So basically it was a 2-week campaign. They scored the targets they wanted to, and then they flipped it off to loopback, which makes it difficult for a researcher because a lot of times if you're not out there collecting the stuff as it happens, you can't go back and get it later. So that was kind of interesting to me. So I hit a dead end on that. But I did look at the macro that was inside, and I was able to pivot on a couple things. So we'll get back to this screenshot in a little bit later, but at the top and the bottom, I highlighted some interesting values. The 2 at the top and the 1 at the bottom, they're used, these hex values were used by the actor in the macro, but surprisingly, they didn't change them that often. So it was a unique value that I could put into a simple YARA-SIG and actually pivot off of and find some more stuff. We'll get back to what they were in a little bit. But I was able to pivot on that, and I found a few more documents that were sent in around middle of July. This is where the tweets come in, but basically, one of them was discussed on Twitter. So take your time, read the tweet, but basically, Rick Cole on the left talks about a spear that they found, and he said, oh, you got a dad joke instead. Talks about the exploit chain that actually I just kind of discussed with you. And then on the right, Nick actually refers to dad joke as well and says probable APT40. So this was, obviously, you could imagine my excitement because I'm such a connoisseur of dad jokes, plus APT40 is a pretty interesting actor, so thanks to them again for dropping those tidbits. So now we have a name. We have a group, APT40, or what we refer to as Leviathan. Unfortunately, when I started going out there and looking for dad jokes, there wasn't really anything out there except for this shirt that my wife bought me because she knows I love them so much. So I kind of hit a dead end again. Luckily, at Kaspersky, we save all the datas all the time. So looking back, I was able to go back and do a retro hunt, and what was surprising is that I only found a total of 8 campaigns since the beginning of 2019. So the malware itself was kind of rare. Usually when you find something, you go back and you'll see consistent campaigns over and over again, usually in the dozens or hundreds of victims, for example, with our data that we have. In this case, we only saw 8 campaigns. The other interesting fact was that this was actually, looks like it began in January of 2019. So this is the possible epoch time for the malware, which is kind of interesting. This is a list of the campaigns I was able to find. Feel free to take pictures. I'll leave it up there for a second if anybody wants IOCs. But essentially, you can see that the actor started using this malware essentially at the first of the year or the third. And then they took about 2 months off. Then they came back, did it again, took another 2 months off, used it again. So consistently every month or two, they'll send 1 or 2 campaigns. But 8 campaigns over a span of now 10 months is actually pretty rare to me. What was even more interesting is that we could see the development cycles happening in between each campaign. So they would use it, presumably, come back to the drawing table, report on bugs and things that happen, fix some things, add some new features, functionalities, whatever, and go back to the drawing board and use it again. So this indicated to me that the actor is being pretty meticulous. They have a developer, they're fixing some stuff that they found, which was pretty interesting to me. So, before we get into the malware, though, we need to actually talk about the actor. Dad joke number 2, bison. So, I got a laugh at the front at least. That was good. There's plenty more where that came from. So, just to get everybody in the room on the same page with APT40, we'll just talk a little bit about them before we go any further. So, they're also known as Leviathan. Like I said earlier, that was a name I think that was made by Proofpoint when they first wrote about them about a year or two, maybe 2 years ago. Microsoft has publicly called them gadolinium. Accenture, I believe it was, put a paper out in maybe February of this year. They called the actor mudcarp. And then on the right-hand side, you see temp.periscope and temp.jumper. That's the old iSight names that we used, or they used, I should say, before they actually wrapped this actor into an official APT number, which was 40. So if anybody wants to cross-reference, those are names that were used. FireEye says they've been active since 2013. Personally, myself, I would say I only see it about 2015, but really the general community hasn't really known about this actor since about late 2018, early 2019, when they started getting some press coverage on some of the campaigns they were running. Referring to some of the campaigns they've done or headlines, this first one, for instance, China. Basically, they say hackers targeting universities. This was in relation to some naval technologies being developed at those universities listed up above. So they targeted them. This is an example of one of the C2s that was tweeted a while back, but you can see the ThyssenKrupp marine system. So you have a trend here on naval technologies. They actually had their hands in the Cambodian election at one point. This was, I forget who actually came out with this research, but maybe FireEye. In July of 2018, again, naval secrets. In this instance here, the actual Chinese Navy did seize an American UUV at one point. They intercepted an underwater or unmanned vehicle. And then when they did that, they actually sent spears and posed as a UUV manufacturer as well to get more technologies. And then I think this was Recorded Future, if I'm not mistaken. They wrote some reporting on how they were using some Russian APT techniques. So if you've seen any of these headlines, this is the actor we're talking about. I mentioned the naval technologies. This was what they focused on early on. They were very heavily involved in gathering information on anything related to naval technologies or maritime interests, and also South China Sea. You'll see a map here in a minute. More recently, though, we see them targeting people or countries or organizations that are invested in the BRI. So they've moved away, not completely, but moved away from the naval stuff and more focused on BRI at this point. So you'll see on the map, FireEye did a really good job in their report back in March on this, but basically you can see very distinct separation of targeting. The interesting part here, why I put this up, is if you look at the South China Sea, pretty much every country that borders that sea has been targeted and hit by these guys. I would argue that Vietnam is actually on the list as well. It's not colored here, but and then you have countries like in the Middle East. You have Norway, UK, US, obviously. This is where they're targeting engineering companies, defense contractors, as well as BRI, energy, stuff like that. So pretty wide across the board. Their end game, obviously, like any other cyber espionage actor, is going after information. They're more of a smash and grab type actor, so they'll come in, they'll find the information they want, bundle it up, ship it out. We don't see them doing anything like destructive attacks or any of that other stuff, financially motivated type things. What's interesting about their tempo is it's fairly consistent, but they always tend to use very short, very targeted campaigns. The people that they target, we're talking defense attaches directly, ministers directly, president's office directly. We're not going after secretaries. We're not going after 100 people in an organization. They're very meticulous with who they target, and then they shut that campaign down very quickly to try to hide what they did. So on to the malware. I like Star Wars. The one on the left is my favorite. He felt your presence. So I broke the malware down into 3 pieces because it had this very intricate exploit chain that was going on. So we're going to talk about the macro or the template first, and then the loader DLL, and then ultimately the end main dad joke payload itself. So on to the template. This is obviously the initial start of the exploit chain. When the document is opened, it will go out and basically fetch a template from a remote location on the server. Inside the template, there's a macro that's executed, and that kicks off a very interesting chain of events. And I show you a couple things here. So first off, the part that's highlighted in white in this URL, feel free to take pictures again because this is, I'll mention this later on in the detection and defense section, but these are pretty unique to this actual macro. So as soon as the macro is run, the first thing it does is it goes and does a GET request to the server of choice, and it does this 2 parameters at the end, the username and the host name, basically beginning back and saying, hey, the macro was run on this box. Then it goes through and it actually extracts the benign executable from the Word doc. In the last wave of attacks, this was a Windows Defender executable that's vulnerable to the load order hijacking. And then it'll send another GET request. And then this time it uses the parameter A equals EXE, basically saying, hey, I was able to pull the executable out of the document. Almost like it's logging. Then it'll go through and actually extract the DLL or the loader from the Word document as well. And it unhides the content to the user, which we'll discuss here in the next slide. And it executes the benign executable, ultimately sideloading the loader into place. And then it sends another GET request. And this time it says A equals run. So those 3 things in order like that is actually a really unique indicator to the macro. Obviously, just talked about that, but basically what this is the actor built this functionality into the macro to track the exploit chain. So if something goes wrong along the way, they're able to say, okay, well, we were able to have the macro execute, and then the EXE got pulled out of the document, but the DLL didn't get sideloaded. So it helps them kind of debug and figure out before they have full access on the box what actually happened in the chain, which is pretty smart. They just look at their web logs, basically. They also use these things called I-shapes in the macro, pardon me. And that was those values that I showed you earlier. So they use these values for the executable, the DLL, and the actual hidden content. So what's unique about this is that the 2 values at the top, we've seen change a little bit, but the one at the bottom has not. So we've observed 3 actual different values for the exe in the loader in all the 8 campaigns we've seen, but they've used the exact same value every time for the hidden content portion. This was kind of a screw up, I think, by their part, so they'll probably see these slides and then change it. Sorry. But for now, it's a really good detection. You're able to pivot and find other stuff just based on that in the macro. So on to the loader. This basically only has 2 functions. It basically extracts the payload from a resource and loads it into memory. And the way it does that is obviously it started using the load order hijacking, and then inside of the actual loader, there's an encrypted config block as well as a compressed payload, LZMA compressed payload, which is the dad joke malware itself. The thing about the loader is it's very small in function, and it only does a couple things, and it's changed every campaign, so it makes it super difficult to sig on. In the latest wave, the configuration block itself is actually 188 bytes, and it's decrypted using a double XOR routine. I think it was like a XOR 88 and then 66. Sorry if I said XOR wrong. But previous versions actually had different sizes for the config blocks. They had different routines, and it made it really, really hard to sig on this DLL, which actually kind of sucks because it's really the only file that's stored on disk. Everything else is run out of memory. So it made it very difficult for us to find things. This is an example of the config block. It's pretty standard if anybody's worked with malware before, hopefully everybody in this room, but up at the top you have the C2s. I highlighted a few interesting pieces here. So the middle part is the web directory where actually all the data gets uploaded to. So they're able to put one or multiple C2s in the config, but then for each victim organization or each person they're going after, they can actually change that config value and have that user's data go to a different folder. So it's easy for them to track. The more interesting pieces are the 2 byte flags that I actually highlighted there. So the first one on the right-hand side, the 00, I found in this last wave that they left the ability in the malware to actually flip a debug switch on. So the malware developer forgot to turn that out or turn it off or take it out. But this is the value in the config block where if you were able to turn that on by making it a non-zero value, the malware will just basically crap out logs like it's going out of style, which is great because if you're not a reverser, you can just run it and look at the log files and see what's going on. The one on the left is actually the persistence flag. So what really sucks is they can turn that to 0 and not even write the DLL to the hard disk in the first place. So everything is in memory, which is really cool, and it makes it very hard to detect. So on to the payload. Let me make sure I didn't skip a slide there. Yeah, we're good. So the payload itself is actually nothing really special. I was hoping there was going to be loads of functionality in this thing, but in reality, it was just basically a beacon and a download and execute stage 2. So this was really designed as a stage 1 payload. Unfortunately, in the last couple waves, we haven't been able to figure out what the stage 2 payload actually is. In previous campaigns in the past, this actor has used things like Cobalt Strike and other COTS and open source type rats. But in this case, I don't really know what it is yet, so we're still looking. Potentially, this is one of those dad shorts or dad bod things, but I don't know. I don't have access to FireEye reporting, so hopefully we can find it. But what was really cool is the actor was, again, very meticulous. Each payload that I looked at was literally compiled a day or 2 before the campaign started. So they were building each individual payload for each victim that they were going after, it's pretty unique for an actor to do that. A lot of times actors will spit out one payload and send it to a bunch of people. In this case, they were really going in, configuring that specific for that victim, sending it, and they could track all their pieces of malware based off of this, so it was pretty cool. Again, the latest piece had actually a debug and persistence switch in the config, and hopefully in the blog we'll have the exact bytes where that's at, so if you do come across this malware, you'll know what byte to flip on. But if you look at it in IDA, it's pretty easy to see the chain of events that have to happen for the debug to happen. So the beacon traffic itself, for those that are interested in network traffic from a defender standpoint, this is kind of what it looks like. I highlighted values in blue because this is generated randomly in the system, but all the stuff in red, other than the payload or the actual data, the header information is hard-coded in the malware. So you can SIG on the user agent, which I don't think in this case is super unique, but there's some other things in there that you might be able to write signatures on, specifically the file name with image. That blue portion is filled in through format strings, for example, so you can write some signatures on that. But basically, it's made to look like a PNG. They slap the PNG header on the front, they do a post to the C2, and then they're off to the races getting data. The data itself is actually encrypted using AES 128, so that's not super unique or anything, but what was unique is the key generation for the actual encryption. A lot of times bad guys will put in the key hard-coded into the malware and go from there and use that as obviously the key for the encryption. In this case, they followed a very weird chain of events, but basically they generate a 64-byte value using the Microsoft API. And then what they did is they prepended this string, secure32.lib, to the front of that 64-byte value. So now they have, whatever it is, 75 bytes or something. And then what they do is they take a SHA-256 of that full value, and that will spit out a 32-byte value that then they split into two 16-byte values, and they use the first one as the key and then the second one as the IV. And then each time they encrypt the next package, they throw the IV in the top of the data, so it's able to be decrypted in CBC mode on the back end. So it was kind of a unique way of generating the key here, but it was pretty interesting to me. Previous versions actually used the string hello everyone. We're talking the ones back in like January, March timeframe. And I think they've changed that to a more benign type string now because everyone started SIGing on hello everyone. They wanted to look more professional, I guess so. But older versions use that as the prepended value instead of the secure32.lib. And the decrypted data, once you decrypt it, it's really nothing super special, but it's just MAC address, username, system name, IP address, etc. So that's basically the malware, but I did want to go through some final things about the actor in particular. Warren, you're missing the math chicken joke. Come on. It's a good one. I want to talk about the attribution caveats. There was a couple things, and also I always like to kind of throw in some defense and detection strategies for those people that are involved in that sort of thing. So on the attribution, FireEye specifically says that this is probable APT40. I've only have the tweet from Nick basically saying this, but I've talked to them and they still don't definitively tie this to the actor. I will say that the malware itself is only unique to this actor that I see, so that is kind of an indication that it's them. But my official stance with our reporting is that with moderate confidence, this is Leviathan or APT40. The reason I say moderate confidence is there were some data points going through when I was writing the report that I found that made me second guess whether this is actually them or not, and I really can't account for why this happened. But in particular, there was one user that actually was targeted with a different malware called NetEagle about a week before they were targeted with dad joke. So it was kind of interesting. The NetEagle malware in particular is usually attributed to APT30, a different Chinese-based actor. So it says to me one of a few things. Either APT30 and APT40 aren't talking to each other and they're both targeting the same victim. I think that might be the case, but it could also mean that APT30 and 40 might be the same person. I'm not really sure. But I think that they're just stepping on each other's toes because they have the same directive and there's many, many teams coming out of China. So this is one of those cases where you have a collision. More interestingly, though, we had this actor group or this activity group that we called Profanly. Pardon if it's spelled wrong. I think some people call it Profoundly was actually the name in the malware. But we have this cluster of activity that we never really had attributed to anybody previously. We just knew it as a cluster. We didn't have an actor with it. What I saw with this, which was really interesting, is that at the end of 2018, I saw Profanly being backed out of systems and then them being targeted with dad joke immediately after. So in December, they removed that, and then in January, there was targeting by dad joke at the same target. So I think it kind of indicates that potentially Profanly, if anybody else has ever tracked that activity, might be another tool or cluster from the Leviathan actor. I'm not really sure. I'd love to talk to some people if they're familiar with that. So on to detection. I mentioned earlier the easiest thing is those 3 URLs. If you're looking at the perimeter, basically at post requests coming out of your network, you're able to pretty easily SIG on those URLs that I highlighted in white. We have had one false positive on that. Some other website actually uses those parameters, but it's pretty rare, and we just put in a little whitelist and it was fine. We haven't really seen any other false positives since then, so that's pretty easy detection. Secondly, if you have the ability to detect macros, if you don't, I would say you should look into something that lets you look into macro code, but if you do have that ability, or if you do break those out based on attachments in your mail server or whatever, looking for those unique I-shape values that I mentioned earlier, that's a pretty easy SIG also to write, and indicates that you're looking at dad joke malware. And then finally, a lot of people don't have this ability, but it needs to become more prevalent, is looking in memory. A lot of actors nowadays are moving to the file list type malware, and the only way you're going to detect it is in memory. So in this case, we couldn't detect the loader DLL because of there's so many changes that happened over the period of 8 months or 10 months. We focused on the actual main payload once it's loaded in memory, or at least decompressed in memory. And this was a pretty good SIG to look at as well, and you can stop it before it's actually called. So again, static detection on the loader was pretty tough, so looking on disk is not that easy to do. If you do business in Southeast Asia, or if you're a defense contractor, or if you deal in naval technologies, you probably should know about this actor. I'm hoping that if you do, you are aware of APT40, but if not, go read about them. They're super important to your business. And then finally, obviously user awareness. I put it in all my slides, but we don't do it enough. We need to train our users more and more. They're the front lines of defense, so please let them know about what these spears look like, how this actor in particular is going after people, and let the defense attaché types know about this training as well, not just your normal staff, because those are the ones being targeted. So at that point, I'll take any questions. Those are my kids. This is usually the reaction I get every time I tell a dad joke. They don't quite get them, but I do. So that's it. Thanks.